The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Book 7. The Last Battle. Chapter 1 by Cauldron Pool. In the last days of Narnia, far up to the west beyond Lantern Waste and close beside the great waterfall, there lived an ape. He was so old that no one could remember when he had first come to live in those parts, and he was the cleverest, ugliest, most wrinkled ape you can imagine. He had a little house built of wood and thatched with leaves, up in the fork of a great tree, and his name was Shift. There were very few talking beasts, or men, or dwarves, or people of any sort in that part of the wood, but Shift had one friend and neighbor who was a donkey called Puzzle. At least, they both said they were friends, but from the way things went on, you might have thought Puzzle was more like Shift's servant than his friend. He did all the work. When they went together to the river, Shift filled the big skin bottles with water, but it was Puzzle who carried them back. When they wanted anything from the towns further down the river, it was Puzzle who went down with empty panaries on his back and came back with the panaries full and heavy. And all the nicest things that Puzzle brought back were eaten by Shift, for, as Shift said,
You see, Puzzle, I can't eat grass and thistles like you, so it's only fair I should make it up in other ways.
And Puzzle always said, "Of course, Shift, of course, I see that." Puzzle never complained, because he knew that Shift was far cleverer than himself, and he thought it was very kind of Shift to be friends with him at all. And if ever Puzzle did try to argue about anything, Shift would always say,
"Now, Puzzle, I understand what needs to be done better than you. You know you're not very clever, Puzzle."
And Puzzle always said, "No, Shift, it's quite true. I'm not clever." Then he would sigh and do whatever Shift had said. One morning, early in the year, the pair of them were out walking along the shore of Cauldron Pool. Cauldron Pool is the big pool right under the cliffs at the western end of Narnia. The great waterfall pours down into it with a noise like everlasting thunder, and the river of Narnia flows out on the other side. The waterfall keeps the pool always dancing and bubbling and turning round and round as if it were on the boil. And that, of course, is how it got its name of Cauldron Pool. It is liveliest in the early spring when the waterfall is swollen with all the snow that has melted off the mountains from up beyond Narnia in the western wild, from which the river comes. And as they looked at Cauldron Pool, Shift suddenly pointed with his dark, skinny finger and said,
"Look, what's that?"
"What's what?" said Puzzle.
"That yellow thing that's just come down the waterfall. Look, there it is again. It's floating, see? We must find out what it is."
"Must we?" said Puzzle.
"Of course we must," said Shift. "It may be something useful. Just hop into the pool like a good fellow and fish it out. Then we can have a proper look at it."
"Hop into the pool?" said Puzzle, twitching his long ears.
"Well, how are we going to get it if you don't?" said the ape.
But, said Puzzle, "wouldn't it be better if you went in? Because, you see, it's you who wants to know what it is, and I don't much. And you've got hands, you see. You're as good as a man or a dwarf when it comes to catching hold of things. I've only got hooves."
"Really, Puzzle?" said Shift. "I didn't think you'd ever say a thing like that. I didn't think of it of you, really."
"Why? What have I said wrong?" said the donkey, speaking in rather a humble voice, for he saw that Shift was very deeply offended. "All I meant was—"
"Wanting me to go into the water?" said the ape. "As if you didn't know perfectly well what weak chests apes always have and how easily they catch cold. Very well, I will go in. I'm feeling cold enough already in this cruel wind, but I'll go in. I shall probably die. Then you'll be sorry."
and Shift's voice sounded as he was just going to burst into tears. Please don't, please don't, please don't, said Puzzle, half braying and half talking. I never meant anything of the sort, Shift, really I didn't. You know how stupid I am, and how I can't think of more than one thing at a time. I'd forgotten about your weak chest. Of course I'll go in. You mustn't think of doing it yourself. Promise me you won't, Shift. So Shift promised, and Puzzle went cloppity-clop on his 4 hooves round the rocky edge of the pool to find a place where he could get in. Quite apart from the cold, it was no joke getting into that quivering and foaming water, and Puzzle had to stand and shiver for a whole minute before he made up his mind to do it. But then Shift called out from behind him and said,
Perhaps I'd better do it after all, Puzzle.
And when Puzzle heard that, he said, No, no, you promised. I'm in now. And in he went. A great mass of foam got him in the face and filled his mouth with water and blinded him. Then he went under altogether for a few seconds, and when he came up again, he was in quite another part of the pool. Then the swirl caught him and carried him round and round, faster and faster, till it took him right under the waterfall itself, and the force of the water plunged him down, deep down, so that he thought he would never be able to hold his breath till he came up again. And when he had come up, and when at last he got somewhere near the thing he was trying to catch, it sailed away from him, till it too got under the fall and was forced down to the bottom. When it came up again, it was further from him than ever. But at last, when he was almost tired to death, and bruised all over, and numb with cold, he succeeded in gripping the thing with his teeth. And out he came, carrying it in front of him, and getting his front hooves tangled up in it, for it was as big as a large hearthrug, and it was very heavy, and cold, and slimy. He flung it down in front of Shift, and stood dripping and shivering, and trying to get his breath back. But the ape never looked at him, or asked him how he felt. The ape was too busy going round and round the thing, and spreading it out, and patting it, and smelling it. Then a wicked gleam came into his eye, and he said,
It's a lion's skin.
Oh, it is, gasped Puzzle.
Oh, I wonder, I wonder,
said Shift to himself, for he was thinking very hard. I wonder who killed the poor lion, said Puzzle presently. It ought to be buried. We must have a funeral.
Oh, it wasn't a talking lion,
said Shift.
You needn't bother about that. There are no talking beasts up beyond the falls or up in the western wild. This skin must have belonged to a dumb wild lion.
This, by the way, was true. A hunter, a man, had killed and skinned this lion somewhere up in the western wild several months before, but that doesn't come into this story. All the same, Shift, said Puzzle. Even if the skin only belonged to a dumb wild lion, oughtn't we to give it a decent burial? I mean, aren't all lions rather solemn? Because of you-know-who, don't you see?
Don't you start getting ideas into your head, Puzzle,
said Shift.
Because thinking isn't your strong point. We'll make this skin into a fine warm winter coat for you.
Oh, I don't think I'd like that, said the donkey. It would look, the other beasts might think. That is to say, I shouldn't feel.
What are you talking about?
Said Shift, scratching himself the wrong way up, as apes do. I don't think it would be respectful to the great lion, to Aslan himself, if a donkey like me went about dressed up in a lion's skin, said Puzzle.
Now, don't stand arguing, please, said Shift. What does a donkey like you know about things of that sort? You know you're no good at thinking, Puzzle, so why don't you let me do your thinking for you? Why don't you treat me as I treat you? I don't think I can do everything. I know you're better at some things than I am. That's why I let you go into the pool. I knew you'd do it better than me. But why can't I have my turn when it comes to something I can do and you can't? Am I never allowed to do anything? To be fair, turn and turn about.
Oh, well, of course, if you put it that way, said Puzzle.
I tell you what, said Shift. You'd better take a good brisk trot down river as far as Chipping Ford and see if they have any oranges or bananas.
But I'm so tired, Shift, pleaded Puzzle.
Yes, but you are very cold and wet, said the ape. You want something to warm you up. A brisk trot would be just the thing. Besides, it's market day at Chipping Ford today. And then, of course, Puzzle said he would go. As soon as he was alone, Shift went shambling along, sometimes on 2 paws and sometimes on 4, till he reached his own tree. Then he swung himself up from branch to branch, chattering and grinning all the time, and went into his little house. He found needle and thread and a big pair of scissors there, for he was a clever ape, and the dwarfs had taught him how to sew. He put the ball of thread, it was very thick stuff, more like cord than thread, into his mouth so that his cheek bulged out as if he were sucking a big bit of toffee. He held the needle between his lips and took the scissors in his left paw. Then he came down the tree and shambled across to the lion's skin. He squatted down and got to work. He saw at once that the body of the lion's skin would be too long for Puzzle and its neck too short. So he cut a good piece out of the body and used it to make a long collar for Puzzle's long neck. Then he cut off the head and sewed the collar in between the head and the shoulders. He put threads on both sides of the skin so that it would tie up under Puzzle's chest and stomach. Every now and then a bird would pass overhead, and Shift would stop his work, looking anxiously up. He did not want anyone to see what he was doing, but none of the birds he saw were talking birds, so it didn't matter. Late in the afternoon, Puzzle came back. He was not trotting, but only plodding patiently along, the way donkeys do. "There weren't any oranges," he said, "and there weren't any bananas, and I'm very tired." He lay down. "Come and try on your beautiful new lion skin coat," said Shift.
"Oh, bother that old skin," said Puzzle. "I'll try it on in the morning. I'm too tired tonight."
"You are unkind, Puzzle," said Shift. "If you're tired, what do you think I am? All day long, while you've been having a lovely, refreshing walk down the valley, I've been working hard to make you a coat. My hands are so tired I can hardly hold these scissors. And now you won't say thank you, and you won't even look at the coat, and you don't care, and...
"My dear Shift," said Puzzle, getting up at once, "I am so sorry. I've been horrid. Of course I'd love to try it on, and it looks simply splendid. Do try it on me at once. Please do."
Well, stand still then, said the ape.
The skin was very heavy for him to lift, but in the end, with a lot of pulling and pushing and puffing and blowing, he got it on to the donkey. He tied it underneath Puzzle's body, and he tied the legs to Puzzle's legs and the tail to Puzzle's tail. A good deal of Puzzle's gray nose and face could be seen through the open mouth of the lion's head. No one who had ever seen a real lion would have been taken in for a moment. But if someone who had never seen a lion looked at Puzzle in his lion skin, he just might mistake him for a lion if he didn't come too close, and if the light was not too good, and if Puzzle didn't let out a bray and didn't make any noise with his hooves.
"You look wonderful, wonderful," said the ape. "If anyone saw you now, they'd think you were Aslan, the great lion himself."
"That would be dreadful," said Puzzle.
"No, it wouldn't," said Shift. "Everyone would do whatever you told them."
but I don't want to tell them anything.
But think of all the good we could do,
said Shift.
You'd have me to advise you, you know. I think of sensible orders for you to give, and everyone would have to obey us, even the king himself. We would set everything right in Narnia.
But isn't everything right already?
said Puzzle.
What?
cried Shift.
Everything right when there are no oranges or bananas?
Well, you know,
said Puzzle.
There aren't many people. In fact, I don't think there's anyone but yourself who wants those sort of things.
There's sugar, too,
said Shift.
Yes,
said the donkey.
It would be nice if there was more sugar.
Well, then, that's settled,
said the ape.
You will pretend to be Aslan, and I'll tell you what to say.
No, no, no,
said Puzzle.
Don't say such dreadful things. It would be wrong, Shift. I may not be very clever, but I know that much. What would become of us if the real Aslan turned up?
I expect he'd be very pleased,
said Shift.
Probably he sent us the lion skin on purpose so that we can set things right. Anyway, he never does turn up, you know, not nowadays.
At that moment, there came a great thunderclap right overhead, and the ground trembled with a small earthquake. Both the animals lost their balance and were flung on their faces.
There,
gasped Puzzle as soon as he had breath to speak.
It's a sign, a warning. I knew we were doing something dreadfully wicked. Take this wretched skin off me at once.
No, no,
said the ape, whose mind worked very quickly.
It's a sign the other way. I was just going to say that if the real Aslan, as you call him, meant us to go on with this, he would send us a thunderclap and an earth tremor. It was just on the tip of my tongue, only the sign itself came down before I could get the words out. You've got to do it now, Puzzle, and please don't let us have any more arguing. You know you don't understand these things. What could a donkey know about signs?
The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Book 7. The Last Battle. Chapter 2. The Rashness of the King. About 3 weeks later, the last of the kings of Narnia sat under the great oak which grew beside the door of his little hunting lodge, where he often stayed for 10 days or so in the pleasant spring weather. It was a low, thatched building not far from the eastern end of Lantern Waste, and some way above the meeting of the two rivers. He loved to live there simply and at ease, away from the state and pomp of Cair Paravel, the royal city. His name was King Tyron, and he was between 20 and 25 years old. His shoulders were already broad and strong, and his limbs full of hard muscle, but his beard was still scanty. He had blue eyes and a fearless, honest face. There was no one with him that spring morning except his dearest friend, Jewel, the unicorn. They loved each other like brothers, and each had saved the other's life in the wars. The lordly beast stood close beside the king's chair, with its neck bent round, polishing its blue horn against the creamy whiteness of its flank.
I cannot set myself to any work or sport today, Jewel, said the king. I can think of nothing but this wonderful news. Think you we shall hear any more of it today?
They are the most wonderful tidings ever heard in our days, or our fathers, or our grandfathers, sire, said Jewel, if they are true.
How can they choose but to be true, said the king. It is more than a week ago that the first birds came flying over us, saying Aslan is here. Aslan has come to Narnia again. And after that it was the squirrels. They had not seen him, but they said it was certain he was in the woods. Then came the stag. He said he had seen him with his own eyes, a great way off, by moonlight in Lantern Waste. Then came that dark man with the beard, the merchant from Carloman. The Carlomenes care nothing for Aslan as we do, but the man spoke of it as a thing beyond doubt. And there was the Badger last night. He too had seen Aslan.
Indeed, sire, answered Jewel. I believe it all. If I seem not to, it is only that my joy is too great to let my belief settle itself. It is almost too beautiful to believe.
Yes,
said the king with a great sigh, almost a shiver of delight.
It is beyond all that I ever hoped for in my life.
Listen, said Jewel, putting his head on one side and cocking his ears forward.
What is it?
asked the king. Hoofs, sire, said Jewel. A galloping horse, a very heavy horse. It must be one of the centaurs. And look, there he is. A great golden-bearded centaur, with man's sweat on his forehead and horse's sweat on his chestnut flanks, dashed up to the king, stopped and bowed low.
Hail, king!
It cried in a voice as deep as a bull's.
Ho there!
said the king, looking over his shoulder towards the door of the hunting lodge.
A bowl of wine for the noble centaur. Welcome, Runewit. When you have found your breath, you shall tell us your errand.
A page came out of the house carrying a great wooden bowl, curiously carved, and handed it to the centaur. The centaur raised the bowl and said,
I drink first to Aslan in truth, sire, and secondly to your majesty.
He finished the wine, enough for 6 strong men, in one draught, and handed the empty bowl back to the page.
Now, Runewit,
said the king,
do you bring us more news of Aslan?
Runewit looked very grave, frowning a little.
Sire,
he said,
you know how long I have lived and studied the stars. For we centaurs live longer than you men, and even longer than your kind, Unicorn. Never in all my days have I seen such terrible things written in the skies as there have been nightly since this year began. The stars say nothing of the coming of Aslan, nor of peace, nor of joy. I know by my art that there have not been such disastrous conjunctions in the planets for 500 years. It was already in my mind to come and warn your majesty that some great evil hangs over Narnia. But last night the rumor reached me that Aslan is abroad in Narnia. Sire, do not believe this tale. It cannot be. The stars never lie, but men and beasts do. If Aslan were really coming to Narnia, the sky would have foretold it. If he were really come, all the most gracious stars would be assembled in his honor. It is all a lie. A lie?
said the king fiercely.
What creature in Narnia or all the world would dare to lie on such a matter?
And without knowing it, he laid his hand on his sword hilt.
That I know not, Lord King,
said the centaur.
But I know there are liars on earth. There are none among the stars.
I wonder, said Jewel, whether Aslan might not come through though all the stars foretold otherwise. He is not the slave of the stars, but their maker. Is it not said in all the old stories that he is not a tame lion?
Well said, Jewel,
cried the king.
Those are the very words. Not a tame lion. It comes in many tales.
Runewit had just raised his hand and was leaning forward to say something very earnestly to the king when all 3 of them turned their heads to listen to a wailing sound that was quickly drawing nearer. The wood was so thick to the west of them that they could not see the newcomer yet, but they could soon hear the words. Whoa, 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 called the voice. Woe for my brothers and sisters! Woe for the holly trees! The woods are laid waste! The axe is loosed against us! We're being felled! Giant trees are falling, falling, falling! With the last falling, the speaker came in sight. She was like a woman, but so tall that her head was on a level with the centaur's. Yet she was like a tree, too. It is hard to explain if you have never seen a Dryad, but quite unmistakable once you have. Something different in the color, the voice, and the hair. King Tyron and the 2 beasts knew at once that she was of the nymph of a beech tree. Justice, Lord King, she cried. Come to our aid. Protect your people. They are felling us in Lantern Waste. 40 great trunks of my brothers and sisters are already on the ground.
What, lady? Felling Lantern Waste? Murdering the talking trees?
Cried the king, leaping to his feet and drawing his sword.
How dare they? And who dares it? Now, by the mane of Aslan!
Ah! Gasped the Dryad, shuddering as if in pain, shuddering time after time as if under repeated blows. Then all at once she fell sideways as suddenly as if both her feet had been cut from under her. For a second they saw her lying dead on the grass, and then she vanished. They knew what had happened. Her tree, miles away, had been cut down. For a moment the king's grief and anger were so great that he could not speak. Then he said,
Come, friends, we must go upriver and find the villains who have done this, and with all the speed we may. I will leave not one of them alive.
Sire, with a good will, said Jewel. But Runewit said,
Sire, be wary even in your just wrath. There are strange doings on foot. If there should be rebels in arms further up the valley, we three are too few to meet them. If it would please you to wait while... I'll not wait the 10th part of a second, said the king. But while Jewel and I go forward, do you gallop as hard as you may to Cair Paravel. Here is my ring for your token. Get me a score of men-at-arms, all well mounted, and a score of talking dogs and 10 dwarves. Let them all be fell archers, and a leopard or so, and Stonefoot the giant. Bring all these after us as quickly as may be. With a good will, sire, said Runewit, and at once he turned and galloped eastward down the valley. The king strode on at a great pace, sometimes muttering to himself and sometimes clenching his fists. Jewel walked beside him, saying nothing, so there was no sound between them but the faint jingle of a rich gold chain that hung round the unicorn's neck, and the noise of 2 feet and 4 hooves. They soon reached the river and turned up it where there was a grassy road. They had the water on their left and the forest on their right. Soon after that they came to the place where the ground grew rougher and thick wood came down to the water's edge. The road, what there was of it, now ran on the southern bank, and they had to ford the river to reach it. It was up to Tyron's armpits, but Jewel, who had 4 legs and was therefore steadier, kept on his right so as to break the force of the current, and Tyron put his strong arm round the unicorn's strong neck, and they both got safely over. The king was still so angry that he hardly noticed the cold of the water, but of course he dried his sword very carefully on the shoulder of his cloak, which was the only dry part of him, as soon as they came on shore. They were now going westward with the river on their right and Lantern Waste straight ahead of them. They had not gone more than a mile when they both stopped and both spoke in the same moment. The king said, What have we here? And Jewel said, Look! It is a raft, said King Tyran. So it was. 6 splendid tree trunks, all newly cut and newly lopped to their branches, had been lashed together to make a raft, and were gliding swiftly down the river. On the front of the raft there was a water rat with a pole to steer it. Hey, water rat! What are you about? Cried the king.
Taking logs down to sell to the Carlamines, sire,
said the rat, touching his ear as he might have touched his cap if he had had one.
Carlamines? Thundered Tyran. What do you mean? Who gave you orders for these trees to be felled? The river flows so swiftly at that time of the year that the raft had already glided past the king and Jewel, but the water rat looked back over its shoulder and shouted out,
The lion's orders, sire, Aslan himself.
He added something more, but they couldn't hear it. The king and the unicorn stared at one another, and both looked more frightened than they had ever been in any battle. Aslan? Said the king at last in a very low voice. Aslan? Could it be true? Could he be felling the holy trees and murdering the Dryads? Unless the Dryads have all done something dreadfully wrong, murmured Jewel. But selling them to Carlamines? Said the king. Is it possible? I don't know, said Jewel miserably. He's not a tame lion.
Well, said the king at last, we must go on and take the adventure that comes to us.
It is the only thing left for us to do, sire, said the unicorn. He did not see at the moment how foolish it was for two of them to go on alone, nor did the king. They were too angry to think clearly, but much evil came of their rashness in the end. Suddenly, the king leaned hard on his friend's neck and bowed his head.
Jewel, he said, what lies before us? Horrible thoughts arise in my heart. If we had died before today, we should have been happy.
Yes, said Jewel, we have lived too long. The worst thing in the world has come upon us. They stood like that for a minute or two, and then went on. Before long, they could hear the hack, hack, hack of axes falling on timber, though they could see nothing yet because there was a rise of the ground in front of them. When they had reached the top of it, they could see right into Lantern Waste itself, and the king's face turned white when he saw it. Right through the middle of that ancient forest, that forest where the trees of gold and of silver had once grown, and where a child from our world had once planted the tree of protection, a broad lane had already been opened. It was a hideous lane, like a raw gash in the land, full of muddy ruts where felled trees had been dragged down to the river. There was a great crowd of people at work, and a cracking of whips, and horses tugging and straining as they dragged the logs. The first thing that struck the king and the unicorn was that about half the people in the crowd were not talking beasts, but men. The next thing was that these men were not the fair-haired men of Narnia. They were dark, bearded men from Carloman, that great and cruel country that lies beyond Archenland across the desert to the south. There was no reason, of course, why one should not meet a Carloman or two in Narnia, a merchant or an ambassador, for there was peace between Narnia and Carloman in those days. But Tyrion could not understand why there were so many of them, nor why they were cutting down a Narnian forest. He grasped his sword tighter and rolled his cloak round his left arm. They came quickly down among the men. Two Carlomans were driving a horse which was harnessed to a log. Just as the king reached them, the log had got stuck in a bad muddy place.
Get on, son of a sloth! Pull, you lazy pig!
Cried the Carlomans, cracking their whips. The horse was already straining himself as hard as he could. His eyes were red, and he was covered with foam.
Work, lazy brute!
Shouted one of the Carlomans, and as he spoke, he struck the horse savagely with his whip. It was then that the really dreadful thing happened. Up till now, Tyrion had taken it for granted that the horses which the Carlomans were driving were their own horses, dumb, witless animals like the horses of our own world. And though he hated to see even a dumb horse overdriven, he was of course thinking more about the murder of the trees. It had never crossed his mind that anyone would dare to harness one of the free, talking horses of Narnia, much less to use a whip on it. But as that savage blow fell, the horse reared up and said, half screaming,
Fool and tyrant! Do you not see I am doing all I can?
When Tyrion knew that the horse was one of his own Narnians, there came over him and over Jewel such a rage that they did not know what they were doing. The king's sword went up and the unicorn's horn went down. They rushed forward together. Next moment, both the Carlomans lay dead, the one beheaded by Tyrion's sword, and the other gored through the heart by Jewel's horn.